Hello, welcome to the All Out Politics podcast from Sky News. I'm Adam Bolton. Joining me this week are the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, the Europe director at the Economist Intelligence Unit, Joan Hoey, and Sky's political correspondent, Kate McCann. Going to talk about the geopolitics of COVID-19 a bit later on, but first of all, another extraordinary and unprecedented week in Westminster. This week, the Prime Minister's absence, and of course, we all wish Boris Johnson well, but how is the government functioning, and who's really in control? Well, let's just start listening to not Boris Johnson, but those people who are stepping into the breach.
The Prime Minister remains in intensive care, where his condition is improving. I can also tell you that he has been sitting up in bed and engaging positively with the clinical team. The Prime Minister is not only my colleague and my boss, but also my friend, and my thoughts are with him and his family.
We've got collective cabinet responsibility, but the arrangements are very clear. The Prime Minister has asked for me to deputise for him in discharging the responsibilities for as long as he's unable to do that. And we have got, in the discharge of those responsibilities and, frankly, the direction, the instructions he's given, very clear plans. So we're all focused with a unity of purpose and a clear and calm determination to get that done, from the procurement of PPE, getting it to the front line, to supporting businesses, and all of the work in DFID and the Foreign Office that we're doing on the international level to reinforce that effort on the home front.
Well, that was Rishi Sunak, followed by Dominic Raab there. Peter, you've been around politics even longer than me. What do you make of Boris Johnson's illness and the way in which he's been stood in for?
Well, I think the thing which occurred to me is that he probably, from as much as I know him, must be a very difficult patient. And he probably was one of those who refused to rest sufficiently, and his problems may have come from that. And I say here that despite my complete and utter disagreement with his government's policy, how very much I hope for him to have a swift and complete recovery, by the way, in case anybody has any doubt that political opposition is transcended by these things. I don't think that this issue of who's in charge really grabs me all that much. I think the British government is so constituted, particularly with the help of the civil service, that government does carry on in the absence of prime ministers, and it has to carry on. If people haven't got the sense to suppress their personal ambitions and rivalries under such circumstances, then I don't know where we are. I think we have to assume, again, whatever one thinks of the politics of the people involved, that we are here dealing with people who can see that it's far too important to engage in these calls. So I don't worry all that much about it. I think there is a difficulty as we approach the 3-week point at which the policy might conceivably be moderated or reversed. That in the absence of the Prime Minister, people are going to be nervous to take any major decision. I think that's a pity, because I think that the original decision that was taken was wrong and needs to be revised, and a way needs to be found out of it. And I think as long as Al Johnson is away from his post, that's going to be harder. So from that point of view, it's a pity that he isn't there, and we all long for him to be back for that reason, if for none other. But I think that the main effect of it is that it makes it less likely that anyone will do any rethinking. On the other hand, I don't see at the moment any huge sign of a rethink, though I do see strong signs of considerable discontent in the Treasury with the huge emerging cost of this and the damage to the economy, the colossal damage to the economy, the chucking into the sea every day of 2 or 3 modern general hospitals and about 30 or 40 schools for a cause which I think is increasingly doubtful.
Joan, do you think it matters that the Prime Minister is out of action?
I think it does, yeah. I think it's a calamity for the nation, and obviously a personal calamity for Boris Johnson and his family as well. And I really wish him all the best. And I'm sure he'll come through this. But we do need Boris back at the helm, and we need him because of the particular character of his leadership, which he's displayed on many occasions. And, I think that, the particular nature of his leadership obviously tied up with his personality, very ebullient, positive, let's get this done sort of personality is precisely what's needed at this moment. Like Peter, I don't have that many qualms really about what is happening in his absence. I mean, Dominic Raab has been chosen because of his position as First Secretary of State, but I believe that everything should function with collective cabinet responsibility. And although there are likely to be tensions between different departments of government, and probably particularly between the Department of Health and the Treasury and Business Department and so on, because of the trying to balance, the public health aspects of this emergency with the huge damaging economic impact, is very difficult at the best of times. So no doubt there's tensions, but I don't really envisage in this situation that these are going to manifest themselves in any kind of open political feuding. I think the cabinet will be rallying around just as the country is rallying around in this situation.
Kate, you're very much at the sharp end of this. I mean, how is the government working? What's it like dealing with them? Do they know what they're doing?
I think in the initial 24-hour period after Boris Johnson went into hospital, there really was a sense of shock in Westminster and a bit of a kind of, God, what do we do now? But actually, since then, there is a feeling that Dominic Raab has performed quite well. He seems to have been quite keen to reiterate to cabinet colleagues that it is all about collective cabinet responsibility, perhaps actually because the scale of the decisions that are being made at the moment are just so huge, and the implications, as Peter was saying, so vast for the future that no one man or woman really wants to have to make them alone. So I think for now it is actually holding okay. We've seen the cabinet have to negotiate this process over lockdown over the last couple of days about the review that Boris Johnson promised would come early next week and how that will be managed. There were back and forth reports yesterday. Was the government just going to postpone this review and wait until the Prime Minister was back on his feet? I think it's now become clear that actually, even if Boris Johnson were to leave hospital by the end of this week, he will not be back in number 10 behind a desk as much as he probably wants to be, because it's not sensible for him to do so. So I think they have started to manage that process of decision making, but actually it's too early to say how it's going to pan out in the long term. A, we don't know when the Prime Minister will be back. And B, we don't know what kind of decisions people are going to have to make. Remember, we've been in lockdown now for around 2 weeks, and it's amazing how quickly things have changed and adapted to that in just such a short space of time. There is no way of knowing what the mood of the country or politicians will be like in another 2 weeks' time, particularly around the economics of this.
Well, before we get on to that, the whole business of the lockdown, and Peter's already raised it, I do just want to put one thing to you. I don't know whether who wants to comment about it. It just strikes me that we don't look after our prime ministers very well, and that if they are important figures, leader of the government, maybe there ought to be a Downing Street doctor. Maybe we shouldn't end up in a situation where a prime minister is cooped up on his own in a small flat. And maybe we shouldn't all be saying he's got to get back to work as quickly as possible when he's been ill. I mean, what do you think, Kate?
I mean, I don't think. Well, I mean, I'm yet to hear lots of people saying he should be back on his feet. And actually, the response to him being in hospital, I think across the board, has been pretty sympathetic. There have been some questions about why he didn't see a doctor sooner. We know that he saw a doctor via Zoom, so online, and then was told to go to hospital on Sunday. But it had become clear by that point to all journalists asking Number 10 about it that the Prime Minister's symptoms hadn't cleared up. You could see in the last video message that he made, he was struggling for breath. So evidently at that point, perhaps somebody should have said, maybe we need to be taking this a bit more seriously. That said, as Joan says, the Prime Minister's character is known to be somebody very strong-willed and strong-headed, and it's very unlikely that he would be willing to just hand over the keys to somebody else and admit himself to hospital.
I mean, Peter, should the Prime Minister get special care in the way that a president does, for example?
Well, I think so. I certainly should have access to the best medicine. We don't really have an equivalent of the Naval Hospital in Bethesda in Maryland, where presidents tend to be treated when there's trouble. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the care that's available to him. The truth is, it's a very stressful job. And under these circumstances, when there is this virus going, I think something which probably under normal circumstances he might not have suffered greatly from, was exaggerated by the stress that he's under. It's not, we must remember that his life has been very personally complicated as well as politically complicated over the past year or so. So it will have hit him harder than it would have normally hit someone of that age and level of health. I think you can really do about that, except to make sure that he does get the necessary rest. But no, sure.
But it's not just him, though, is it? I mean,
that's a decent treatment.
It's not just him. I mean, we've had other, officials and ministers disproportionately compared to other national leaderships going down with the virus. I mean, it just occurred to me that maybe the whole sort of Downing Street, Palace of Westminster model is just not very healthy these days.
I think
it never has been, has it?
I was going to say, Adam, I think actually there is a bigger question in there about the way that the social distancing measures were actually being observed in Downing Street, because there have been lots of reports over the last couple of days of officials in meetings coughing, round a table full of very, very senior people. The Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, the Chief Medical Officer, all went down with the virus at pretty much the same time, which was actually pretty terrible timing for people who needed to communicate what was happening with the country. Those are some pretty important questions. We were stood outside Number 10, as we are, or were before lockdown, doing live hits outside Number 10 and watching officials go in a group, all together, definitely not standing 2 metres apart. So certainly some questions about whether or not they were taking their own advice.
I think, maybe that's a bit harsh. And I've heard some harsh criticisms, that they weren't, the Prime Minister and others were not observing their own social distancing advice. But in the midst of a crisis, I think it was very important that they were seemed to be working flat out, and inevitably they probably didn't observe the social distancing measures, because in the midst of this crisis they had to take the risk and continue as usual. When I think of Boris, I think of that saying, Hippocrates probably, that it's more important to know the man who has the disease than the disease the man has. I think, as Peter says, Boris is probably quite a difficult patient, and not somebody who's going to be calling the doctor. He's not going to be one of the worried well types, and would have insisted on carrying on, just as others, I think, in the leadership team did as well. So I'm sure he was getting the best medical advice and attention. I'm not sure that he would have been listening that hard.
Could I make another point about this, which I think is actually important to the whole discussion? We tend to assume when people fall victim to this disease that it's a result of things which have happened in the immediate past. I have a strong suspicion that the Oxford report, which the Financial Times published, has a lot of force to it, that in fact the disease is already far more widespread, that many more people have had it, and that it may well be incubating now in people since long before the shutdown began. People apparently remain infectious for a startlingly long time after they've recovered from it as well. So I think we may be, all this business about whether the level of social distancing has been observed, maybe a mistaken response. We may simply not understand just how widespread the coronavirus is already among us, and that a lot of the people who are falling ill from it now are falling ill from it because it was widespread quite possibly months ago, and has been spreading in the population for a very considerably longer time than is widely assumed. I put that in because it's part of my argument and part of the whole sceptical position which I maintain, that we may just be imagining that this shutdown is more effective than it actually is.
Okay, Peter, with your customary skill, you brought things around to what you want to talk about, which fortunately is what I want to talk about as well. This whole question of the lockdown, you basically think it's a mistake. Explain, please.
Well, I think it's disproportionate. I think that obviously actions have to be taken in response to diseases of this kind. They have definite dangers, particularly to the old and unwell, and we don't, obviously not only to them, as we've had illustrated by what's happened to the Prime Minister. So it'd be crazy to do nothing, But that doesn't mean that the only thing we could possibly do is shut down the economy, destroy gross domestic product per head, and also store up for ourselves political, economic, and social problems, which will threaten the life and health of the population for decades to come. And this isn't. I will be accused of making a life versus money argument, which I reject completely. I'm a Christian, and I take the John Donne position that every man's death diminishes me. I don't want anyone to die unnecessarily. But a policy has to be rational, and it has to be in proportion to the threat it's supposed to be dealing with. And I think that this has been a grotesque and gigantic overreaction, and I think it's doing the most terrifying damage to the British economy and due to the world economy. But I have to think here of the only country over which I have any influence as a citizen. I think it's just misconceived. And therefore, the other thing which I've been distressed by is the complete failure of civil society to conduct a rational debate on it. From the start, the argument for shutting down the economy and for severely limiting the personal liberty of individual citizens has been accepted without question. The opposition rolled over and died. Parliament was supine. The civil service was supine. Most of the media have been supine. There is no policy on earth, whether I'm right or wrong, and obviously I could be wrong, there's no policy on earth which is not improved by articulate and informed opposition. There has been no such opposition from those institutions, bodies and persons in our society who are supposed to provide it. That's always bad.
Joan, what do you think?
I think it's very, very important that people like Peter and others who continue to raise questions and be sceptical even about the measures that have been taken, and that those people should have a voice and that there should be a debate. That's entirely right and proper. In fact, it's more important now than ever, given the extraordinary measures that are being put in place in this country and elsewhere. And that debate should be ongoing. Now, whether the government response was proportionate is very difficult to say at this moment. What we do know is that this government was much more reluctant to rush into doing that than others who embraced the lockdown with alacrity and some enthusiasm as well. Boris Johnson didn't want to particularly go down that route that fast. Now, I believe, looking at what we know about this disease is that it is highly contagious and that it is quite virulent in relation to a certain age cohort and people with underlying health problems. I think it was inevitable for one reason that lockdown measures had to be put in place at a certain point, because the sole purpose of those is to make sure that the health service is able to cope, to be prepared for the large influx of patients and wouldn't be overwhelmed. So I think it was probably right and proper that it was these measures were taken, but I think they should be subject to ongoing review and questioning. And I would hope that Boris Johnson and his government will not want those measures to stay in place for a day longer than is necessary. And even though we're not at the stage where probably we can contemplate relaxing those measures to any great degree at present, because the case numbers and deaths are still rising, and the rate of increase is likely to increase in the next few days, over the next week. Nevertheless, that discussion is taking place, and all governments have to calibrate the timing and phasing of this return to some degree of normality. And I think that depends on several things, most importantly, the progression of the pandemic, the capacity of the health service to cope, and then we have to consider the impact on the economy, the other casualties of these measures, and we have to have testing in place, which is obviously absent at the moment.
Kate, the government and its advisors did really change their mind, didn't they, about the need for a lockdown?
Well, they did. I mean, the original lockdown measures, as Jones says, which were introduced, they needed to have 75% compliance. That was the scientific advisors' number in order to be effective. And ultimately, having looked at the data after they were first introduced, it was clear to number 10 that that wasn't the case. And that's why there were these stricter lockdown measures, which have subsequently been introduced and have now been in place for a couple of weeks.
No, but I meant really going back to the beginning of the year, the mood here, you drawing attention to that lengthy Reuters report, the mood clearly was, we weren't going to go down that path at all.
Yeah, I think that Reuters report that you mentioned, Adam, is really, really worth a read because some amazing journalism has gone into it and lots of in-depth interviews. What that report essentially says is that the scientists were aware that this virus was circulating, but initially thought it would be a flu-like illness and that actually it wouldn't necessarily affect too many people and therefore we shouldn't be too worried about it. The government took that advice on board, and that's why we didn't see really this kind of ramping up until the very last moment, actually. The level of threat that this was deemed to be remained at low or moderate for quite a long time. And then when the scientists did, start to say, well, actually, we could see some pretty high death figures here, that's when that report came out saying there could be 250,000 people could die. That's the point at which Westminster seems to have sat upright and really sort of taken this into account. I think, though, Jones' point is crucial here about why are we seeing these measures? Is it because lots of people are going to die and we want to avoid that? Or is it actually because the NHS is going to become overwhelmed very quickly? And that's really what this is about. And it's that latter point that the government knows that there are just not the capacity in the NHS to cope. And that's why we're in lockdown. It's not necessarily, as Peter says, this argument about trying to avoid casualties altogether, although clearly that is important and none of us would want to see anybody die of this illness. It's not necessarily a straightforward argument.
Could I just insert a point here? Everybody who's spoken about this has assumed that there is some evidence that shutting down the economy and compelling people to stay at home has any effect on COVID-19 deaths. I don't believe there is any such evidence. If you look at all the countries where there have been outbreaks of disease, you find a great variety of response. We can't, of course, rely on very much that comes out of China because it's a censored secret police state, and we don't really know whether the figures or the accounts that we've had are even true or can be taken seriously. But if you look at across Asia, from Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, or into Latin America or the United States or the major European countries involved, with many different approaches, what you will not find is any consistent pattern of the connection between the actions taken by the governments and what's happened afterwards. People, for instance, often praise what the Hong Kong and Singapore governments did and say that following it, the incidence of the disease declined or leveled off. But actually, if you look at Hong Kong and Singapore, they took different measures, so you can't even find a consistency there.
But I think
there is no mathematical relationship whatsoever between the continued instance of the disease, and there's also people are not.
Well, that's what you think. Let's find out what does Joan think. How do you read the statistics?
People are not interrogating the figures which they're. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer said on Sunday in the government press conference that the figures included people who died effectively with COVID-19, but not necessarily of it. And this distinction is not being adequately made in a lot of the figures. So we're being faced with all kinds of uninterrogated, unexamined figures and an absolute presumption that there is a connection between shutting down the economy and sparing the pressure on the NHS. Again, Sweden, which is the one country which, in my view, has been behaving in a rational, proportionate fashion, and is therefore not an outlier, but the normal country surrounded by outliers, has not experienced, as a result of following its policy, any gigantic explosion of the disease so far, nor is its intensive care capacity being overwhelmed. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? A lot more than we are asking that now.
What do you say, Joan? No evidence that it works?
Well, I have to say we have to keep asking these questions, and the honest answer is that we can't know. First of all, we can't know the counterfactual, what would have happened if this hadn't been done. And I don't know if Sweden is the place to look to at the moment. They're about 2 weeks behind everywhere else, and it's not to say that they haven't implemented measures at all. But I think many
687 recorded deaths in Sweden at the moment.
Sorry?
687 recorded deaths from coronavirus in Sweden.
Yeah, and they're several weeks behind. Let's see. I mean, I'm not disputing it. I think that at the moment, a lot of the statistics we're seeing don't actually tell us very much, and that's because different methodologies are being used in different countries. We can't compare like with like. We can't compare death rates really at all. I mean, there's huge difference, for example, between the death rate in Italy and Germany. Are those really very meaningful? Given the disparities in testing, given the disparities in terms of healthcare capacity, given the disparities in the age of the population, average age, and so on. There are very many difficulties here, and also the fact that so many different modelers and experts are coming up with different projections, tells us that we should be very skeptical. We're at the very beginning, really, of this pandemic, and we still know very little. And it's very important that we do look at the data very quickly. And I suppose we can make some suppositions that about 50% of the population eventually, because we do have to develop herd immunity, will get this disease, that about 80% of those cases will be asymptomatic or mild, and about 20% of cases will be more serious. We don't actually really know what the death rate will be, and we cannot know that until after the fact. And it's likely, I suppose 1% is a figure that's given. It's likely probably to be less than that, but it's far, far higher than for seasonal flu, for example. And that's why we've had to have a particular response to this public health emergency. And as I said, I think the sole reason for these extraordinary measures, which none of us should really welcome and do at all, and we want them to be eased as soon as possible, is to ensure that health services can cope with the influx of patients. And as soon as we can ease those measures, the better. But we do have to follow the progression of the disease. Now, what we can see, Singapore and Japan were held up as success stories. They've had to re-implement measures because cases are rising again. We know that China has gone back to work, and they've had to lock down more cities in other provinces over the last few days. Wuhan reopened yesterday, 11 weeks after it went into lockdown. Now, I think most governments in Europe do not want to wait 11 weeks before they start to ease these measures. They want to shorten that timeline. And that's why everybody is discussing already exit strategies, because the economic costs and the other collateral damage associated with that is so huge.
Well, I'm not quite as sceptical as Peter about the statistical evidence. It seems to me that those places who have implemented the strongest lockdowns and measures against the virus have been those who've been most successful in slowing the rate and reducing ultimately the rate of infections. But, of course, the other question is that many epidemiologists suggest that if those measures are listed too soon, there will simply be a new spike. And as far as the economic impact is concerned, I think the argument is that if the health service was on its knees and crashed, then the longer-term economic impact would be even worse than the consequences of the shutdown, wouldn't it, Peter?
Well, but as long as this argument is accepted, then we're doomed to undergo this pretty much forever. No government could dare relax these procedures as long as we accept that shutting down the economy is.
I mean, 11 weeks, like in China, does that strike you as unreasonable?
I can't see how logically you can get out of it if you carry on believing this thing. I simply don't agree with you. You look at Spain and Italy and France, where countries which have more recent experiences of despotism than us, and which have, in many cases, paramilitary police forces and the power to compel people to remain in their homes under much more restricted circumstances than here. I don't see that the reduction in the incidence of the disease shows much sign that policy has been a success.
Well, they all believe that they are flattening the curve, to use the phrase, or flattening the sombrero, whatever you want to say.
So the figures they produce are still extremely high, and the best you could come up with would be a post hoc ergo propter hoc claim. Even then, what you haven't got is any evidence that it works. I also find that Japan has introduced technically a state of emergency, its provisions are extremely mild. The number of deaths in Japan is still extraordinarily low, so I think we have to be clear that
94.
There may be some which are a much greater population than ours. There may be some political pressure on Mr. Abe to introduce something which looks tough, because obviously countries which are standing out from this do face both internal and external pressure to conform with what's now become the norm. But I still say that we have not got here any evidence that this policy is actually justified by practical result. What we do beyond doubt have is piling up enormous evidence of the catastrophic effect which it is having on the economies of those countries which have imposed it. And this is simply beyond doubt. The numbers of the figures which are being spent, of money which we do not have, the numbers of people who are losing their jobs, the companies which are closing down. I mean, people seriously imagine that at the end of this, all those who've been furloughed are going to go back to jobs as they were before? Do people think they're going to be paid the wages they had before? Do they think they're going to be paying the taxes they paid before all this? Do they think that the currency is going to retain the value that it previously had? They're completely deluded if they imagine this. This is enormous. This is quite possibly, and people having their wages cut in this country for the first time in the 1930s. This is an enormous development. People are going to be appalled when they actually become aware of what it really means. And sooner or later, government's going to have to say, can we carry on with this? Is it conceivably justified? And to do that, we need to start thinking about this instead of accepting the circular argument that we accepted from the beginning, that shutting down the economy would save lives, which has not actually been proven to be true at all, and is increasingly leading us into an unstoppable avalanche of economic catastrophe, which all of us will hate when we find out the true consequences of it for us and for everyone we know and love and for the whole country.
Kate, that's not what they're saying in 10 Downing Street, is it?
Well, I mean, I think, Peter talks about evidence. These measures have been in place for 2 weeks. There's a 2-week lag on the progression of this virus. It's very, very difficult to be able to give solid evidence for what works and what doesn't. I'm interested, though, Peter, if in theory you're suggesting that the UK government shouldn't have opted for the lockdown measures that it did. In that case, the assumption would be that many people would catch the virus and ultimately acquire herd immunity. Now, there are issues with that, not least Professor Newton, the government's expert on testing, said that there is no guarantee that people get immunity. There's a study in South Korea which suggests that many people actually don't have antibodies after they have the virus. So that argument is not necessarily proven. But setting that to one side, if that were the case and that were the path that the government should have taken, how would you have guaranteed that the economy could have kept working anyway, given that the majority of people would have got ill, many of whom would have been unwell? And this virus does not just affect older people. It can also take a pretty significant toll on younger people too. How would the economy have managed that?
Well, I can't guarantee anything. What I can say is that these measures have made the economic problems of the country immeasurably worse than they would have been if they hadn't been undertaken.
But how do you know that?
Well, because of the evidence of my own eyes. If you do what we have done and you prevent effectively people from going to work and businesses from operating, as we have done, then you will strangle the economy. You simply destroy supply. There is no money coming into large parts of the economy. The only money which exists is money which is magicked out of Rishi Sunak's magic money forest and poured into the economy from the future. Basically, we are spending the future, billion after billion after billion, chucking, as I say, hospitals and schools and railways and roads and everything else people want into the sea, and on a scale not seen since the mad defence of the ERM back in the days of Norman Lamont. Only on much greater scale than that, an extraordinary expenditure of money on a very dubious and suspicious policy, money which we do not have, which the country will struggle to make up for, as I say, in the future, which our children and grandchildren will have to live in.
And I think even the Treasury, Adam, I'm right in saying, have accepted that is the case, that this is a huge burden on the economy and it will be paid off for many, many years to come by future generations. But I just suppose if you're making the argument that there isn't enough evidence to show that this policy would work, I struggle with the idea that there is no evidence that the alternative would work. And actually, given that if you allowed the economy to continue and allowed the virus to play out, there may not have been the government bailout that there was. I don't see a situation in which you could avoid many businesses going under, many people avoiding restaurants, because that was actually happening even before this lockdown was put in place. You know, there were some people who felt, I don't want to go out, I'm going to cancel my holidays, I'm going to come back early from my trip. There's no guarantee that the economy wouldn't have ground to a halt anyway because people were so afraid about it. I think if we're talking about evidence, we have to be clear that actually there's no evidence for either argument yet. It's too soon to tell. There is a lag, and we will have to see in the future looking back.
The government has encouraged a very high level of fear by the policies which it has followed. It has greatly increased the fear of this disease. What we are experiencing
Listen,
here
Peter, let's just put it at its simplest. Hang
not,
on. The Imperial College advice to the government was potentially that if steps weren't taken to change behaviour, 500,000 people could die. Are you saying that that was acceptable?
Well, that's what Imperial College. Imperial College are not the only experts in this. And the people who
I understand, but they are scientists. That's what they're saying. And, ultimately, to follow your course, you have to accept that is acceptable. That is a risk you are prepared to take.
I don't think that's what Peter is saying. Actually, I think what he's saying is that the policies that have been put in place are economically catastrophic, which they are.
Well, we know that.
There's no way around it. Well, yes. So, and that also has other consequences, social consequences. That takes a toll on the health of the nation as well. Mental health, physical health. There are other, casualties in this as well. So,
but they're also not in isolation. That's another point.
No, the point
they're not in isolation in this country.
Sorry?
They're not in isolation in this country, and so much of economics is competitive, and our competitors are doing the same thing.
They are indeed, and we can discuss what the consequences and how all this can be unwound afterward. That's going to be a huge challenge. My point is that the government's priority in this situation was to ensure that the health service of this country was able to cope. And that was the full mobilization of the government in the early weeks to put that in place. And I think they have done that well to a large degree. We have weaknesses and failures, particularly in the area of testing. I think it was also important that they did that in order to retain public confidence as well. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the NHS would have been completely, utterly overwhelmed if measures had not been put in place, because we're already, anybody who, and I have been in very close contact with ICUs over the past year for reasons that I don't need to explain, but that is pure hell working in those ICUs at the moment, which have been expanded to take over whole hospitals. So it was right and proper, to my mind, that the government took those measures. And we are beginning to see some evidence that this curve is beginning to flatten. No, I think what he is suggesting is that we do need to question the strategy, and we need to be looking at an exit strategy, which I think all governments are doing at the moment, and what are the factors that will allow us to ease these measures, allow cases and the rate of death to remain under control, so health services can cope, that public confidence remains strong, and crucially parts of the economy recover. So I think that's the focus of the next few weeks. It's understandable that the government doesn't want to focus on that publicly at the moment because we're still at an early stage, and we expect the expectation is that the death toll is actually going to rise over coming days.
OK, let's turn from this to the geopolitics of it. Certainly Donald Trump has consistently seen this in terms of international competition, criticising China and the World Health Organization. Let's listen to what one of the things he had to say and how the Director General of the World Health Organization reacted.
They've been wrong about a lot of things, and they had a lot of information early, and they didn't want to. They seem to be very China-centric, and we have to look into that. So we're going to look into it. We give a majority of the money that they get, and it's much more than the $58 million is a small portion of what they've gotten over the years. Sometimes they get much more than that. Sometimes it's for programs that they're doing, and it's much bigger numbers. And if the programs are good, that's great as far as we're concerned. But we want to look into it. World Health Organization, because they really are. They called it wrong. They missed the call. They could have called it months earlier. They would have known, and they should have known, and they probably did know. So we'll be looking into that very carefully.
The focus of all political parties should be to save their people. Please don't politicize this virus. It exploits the differences you have at the national level. If you want to be exploited, and if you want to have many more body bags, then you do it. If you don't want many more body bags, then you refrain from politicizing it.
Okay, Peter, what do you make of the way Trump is presenting this, looking for enemies, looking for China, the World Health Organization?
He's a flailing demagogue and always has been, and is now looking for somebody else to blame. I no doubt the World Health Organization is far from perfect and has been notably sycophantic to China in recent months, particularly in pretty much failing to mention the existence of Taiwan, something which always annoys the Chinese. But I don't think its performance has been especially bad, or this attack has been particularly justified. People who observe the WHO seem to say that it's in fact under its current leadership it's working better than it did before. I'm also not sure that Mr. Trump's theories about where he gets his money from are entirely right. But I'm always baffled as to how anybody ever takes the President of the United States seriously in any public pronouncement anyway.
But they do, don't they?
I'm afraid I don't know. It's all I've always struggled to do it and to know what to say, except that basically what one sees as a very large child in the Oval Office, and it's disturbing to watch. And one hopes to change the subject because there's nothing whatever anybody can do about it, especially now that the Democratic Party seems to have decided to pick another loser to come up against him in the coming election.
What do you make of, Joan, of the kind of decision that Trump appears to have taken to blame the rest of the world and the World Health Organization, and particularly China, for this?
Well, it's par for the course, but I think there are questions to be asked, obviously, about the management of this crisis, both in China, where there was a huge lack of transparency, to say the least, and a mismanagement of the crisis in the early days from December onwards. And no doubt questions will be asked in future about the role of the World Health Organization as well. But this, as far as I see, is part of an ongoing propaganda war or information war between the US and China. And it's also in part an attempt to deflect attention by Donald Trump from his own mismanagement of the crisis, his initial dismissal of the threat, refusal to take it seriously, and obviously to point the finger of blame elsewhere in the context of a very severe public health crisis in the US and in the context of the forthcoming election. And as we know, in times of crisis, great power rivalries tend to hot up rather than abate, and this is no exception. And we're likely to see more of this, with China trying to disown responsibility for what's happened, and the US really firmly trying to call this the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus. I think at the moment, the problem, particularly for the US, is that it hasn't got the capacity to act as world leader in the midst of this crisis. And that's allowing China it's giving China an opportunity to try and fill that vacuum. So what we're seeing is a continuation of this kind of rivalry. This pandemic has not caused this, but it's certainly accentuating that rivalry.
I get the sense, Kate, that in Downing Street, the British government desperately keen to offend neither America nor China.
I think Downing Street believes it's got enough problems on its hands at the minute with the Prime Minister in hospital. But it is interesting, Adam, this wider question of what will happen after this virus. Will we see a continuation, if you like, of the fracturing of those kind of geopolitical links? If you look at the way Europe has tackled this crisis, it hasn't been a coherent response. There are vast differences in the way this has been managed between Italy, France and Germany, and hugely different death tolls as a result. Now, in the later stages of this pandemic, there's been cooperation across those borders, but it certainly hasn't been a united response. And there is, some of that othering we've seen of China, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. Are we going to see states moving back and sort of rescinding into themselves? Is that going to be the result of this? Or actually, when we come out of it, will people try to work together again? I think that broader question about what this is going to mean for the future, particularly in that context of geopolitics and working together, is interesting. And that's why the World Health Organization argument matters. The same as all these arguments about NATO that Trump has made in the past. Should states be working together to tackle big worldwide problems? Probably yes, and we've seen the result when they don't, in the sense that Dominic Raab had to spend lots of time on the phone over the last couple of weeks to individual states trying to get planes to be able to land in different countries. That's a huge question, and I think we won't know the answer for years to come after this virus.
This is very interesting, isn't it? Particularly as regards the United States. Of course, it's a presidential year. We've had Bernie Sanders pulling out, so we know it's going to be Joe Biden taking on Trump. And there's some people, I noticed Daniel Finkelstein saying yesterday that this could be the end of the American century, of American hegemony. What do you feel?
Well, I think it ended during the last Iraq War, I think, which was the equivalent to the United States of the Second Boer War for Britain, where it overreached itself and ultimately destroyed its supremacy. Though it will take time for this to happen. What I much more greatly fear is that the economic devastation which the formerly advanced nations of the world now undergo will create an awful lot more demagogues of the type of Mr. Orban and Mr. Trump, and that we shall see a general decline into shouting and the waving of brightly coloured banners as in politics, and the decay and disappearance of reason and restraint. I think people have not seen in the advanced countries of the world since the 1940s, have not seen the level of disruption which we are now inviting into our countries, and it scares the pants off me. Sometimes I'm quite pleased that I'm old, except that I have to consider the fact that I have children and grandchildren. I do not understand how it is that the political and media and academic classes of the major countries of the world are not more alarmed by the extraordinary mistake which we are making and are not raising their voices more in criticism of it. I am determined to raise mine on every available opportunity.
Joan.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that this crisis will be an accelerant of pre-existing trends that are already that's already quite clear, I think. So, for example, I think it will accelerate the continuing fragmentation and breakdown of the post-war political order, especially in Europe. I think the backlash against globalization will receive more force after this. We will see, to some degree, a rehabilitation of the nation state, something that was already in train. I think in Europe, coming after sovereign debt crisis, migrant crisis, and now this, and we look at what is happening, the incredible tensions, north-south, east-west, within Europe, the EU is not going to come out of this very well at all, and it will definitely be weakened and not strengthened. So I think, yes, we're going to see an acceleration of trends. I don't know if China will really be able to take full advantage of the US retreat in this situation. China is not going to bounce back strongly at all. It's probably going to have about 1% growth this year, if at all. And it will have to contend with a backlash in relation to its own handling, mismanagement of this crisis. But I do share Peter's concerns about the ability of the developed countries, the most mature economies, the richest nations, to actually recover from this. And I think there is a serious underestimation of the economic fallout, which it will be long-lasting from this crisis. It is doing tremendous damage, and how these measures are going to be unwound, I think is going to pose a really serious challenge. And my fear is that there will be a Japanification of Europe, and including the UK, that we will become zombie economies over the next period. There's also the question of a political and fallout and social unrest. I mean, when you look at the unemployment figures that are coming out of every single developed country at the moment, unemployment is usually a lagging indicator in terms of social unrest, but I think it could come much sooner than it has done in the past. For example, after the 2008-2009 crisis, where we saw this big upsurge of social unrest in 2011. So these are all really, really big and serious problems that are not really being discussed at the moment.
Well, we've been discussing them. Thank you very much indeed for that. A very sobering edition of the All Out Politics podcast. My thanks indeed to the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, to the Europe Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit, Joan Hoey, and to Sky's political correspondent, Kate McCann. Please stay with Sky News for full coverage of this evolving and grim situation. But that's all for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, happy Easter and thanks for listening.